President Joe Biden and former President Donald Trump have won the Michigan primaries, further solidifying the all but certain rematch between the two men. Today is Wednesday, February 28, 2024, and this is the Dunkley Report. President Joe Biden and former President Donald Trump have won the Michigan primaries, further solidifying the all but certain rematch between the two men. Still, the results are highlighting some of their biggest political vulnerabilities ahead of the November general election. A vigorous, uncommitted campaign organized by activists disillusioned with Biden's handling of the war in Gaza far surpassed the 10,000 vote goal set by organizers. As for Trump, he has now swept the first 5 states on the Republican primary calendar, but Trump continues to struggle with some influential voter blocs who have favored former UN Ambassador Nikki Haley in previous contests. Israel and Hamas are inching toward a new deal that would free some of the roughly 130 hostages held in the Gaza Strip in exchange for a weeks-long pause in the war. U.S. President Joe Biden says a deal could go into effect as early as Monday, ahead of what is seen as an unofficial deadline. That's the start of the Muslim holy month of Ramadan, around March 10th. A deal would bring some respite to desperate people in Gaza, as well as to the anguished families of hostages taken during Hamas' October 7th attack that sparked the war. Congressional leaders emerged from an intense Oval Office meeting with President Joe Biden speaking optimistically about the prospects for avoiding a partial government shutdown beginning this weekend. However, things are still at a crossroads on assistance for Ukraine and Israel, as the president and others in the meeting urgently warned House Speaker Mike Johnson of the grave consequences of delay. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer says those in the meeting told Johnson, "Get it done." But Johnson emerged from the meeting without mentioning Ukraine. He said, "The first priority of the country is our border and making it secure." The killing of nursing student in Georgia has become an issue in the 2024 presidential campaign. The suspect in last week's slaying of Laken Riley is a Venezuelan man who entered the U.S. illegally and was allowed to stay to pursue his immigration case. Former President Donald Trump blamed President Joe Biden and his border policies for the Augusta University student's fatal beating. He and other Republicans have suggested migrants are committing crimes more often than U.S. citizens, even though the evidence does not back up those claims. Democrats have been more muted. Many expressed sorrow for Riley's death. Some have accused Trump of exploiting a tragedy and using xenophobic rhetoric for political gain. 2 men have been convicted of murder in the death of Run-DMC star Jam Master Jay. The brazen 2002 shooting left investigators at a loss for nearly 2 decades. An anonymous Brooklyn federal jury delivered the verdict Tuesday in the trial of 40-year-old Carl Jordan Jr. and 59-year-old Ronald Washington. Jordan was the rap star's godson. Washington was an old friend who was bunking at the home of the DJ's sister. Both men were arrested in 2020 and pleaded not guilty. Jay was gunned down in his studio October 30th, 2002. Authorities were deluged with tips, rumors, and theories, but struggled to get witnesses to open up. The U.S. Army is slashing the size of its force by about 24,000, which is nearly 5%. The cuts will mainly be in already empty posts, not actual soldiers. It's also restructuring to be better able to fight the next major war. The changes come as the Army struggles with recruiting shortfalls that have made it impossible to bring in enough soldiers to fill all the jobs. The cuts include jobs related to counterinsurgency that swelled during the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, but are not needed as much today. About 3,000 of the cuts would come from Army Special Operations Forces. The scene in classrooms around the country is similar. Kids are on their phones, even when school rules forbid it. Teachers say they see students on Snapchat, listening to music, and even watching Netflix in class, among countless other examples of how smartphones distract from teaching and learning. Increasingly, educators are speaking with one voice on the question of how to handle it. Ban phones during classes. A growing number of leaders at the state and federal levels have begun endorsing school cell phone bans and suggesting new ways to curb access to the devices. Two of the biggest grocery chains in the United States had hoped to complete the largest supermarket merger in the country's history this year. But their plan to compete with big box retailers by combining forces faces legal challenges that make it look far less likely. On Monday, the U.S. Federal Trade Commission filed an administrative complaint against Kroger's $24.6 billion deal to acquire Albertsons. A federal lawsuit the agency filed with the attorneys general from 8 states and the District of Columbia seeks to block the proposed merger. The FTC says it would result in store closures and higher prices for shoppers in places where the Albertsons and Kroger now compete. For political prisoners, life in Russia's penal colonies and labor camps is a grim reality of physical and psychological pressure, insufficient food, poor health care, sleep deprivation, and arbitrary rules that are impossible to obey. Following the still unexplained death of Alexei Navalny in an Arctic prison on February 16, human rights advocates fear that no one behind bars is safe. Former inmates, their relatives, and human rights advocates paint a bleak picture of a prison system that descended from the USSR's Gulag. While there have been some reforms, an Amnesty International researcher says the backbone of the Soviet system remains. A gala thrown by the Black Conservative Federation over the weekend drew condemnation from Democrats after its guest of honor, Donald Trump, addressed the largely black audience with remarks that played to racial stereotypes about the criminalization of African Americans. For around 500 conservative lawmakers, activists, pundits, and donors in attendance, Trump's appearance was part of an effort to show the former president's affinity with black voters. The divergent reactions to the former president's remarks highlight both the often lonely place black GOP activists hold in the party and the uphill battle Republicans have in making serious inroads with black voters who still hold highly negative views of the GOP, according to recent AP polling. Today's news was reported by the Associated Press. This has been the World News for Wednesday, February 28th, 2024. Thanks again for joining us at The Dunkley Report.